Everybody should get such a warm introduction when they don't need one at all. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so that works. So David Hume has a special place in the British human nature tradition, or at least that's what I'm going to try to be showing. We know he sees himself as part of such a tradition and considers himself to be one of the principal founders of this tradition going forward. And in addition, I think a case can be made that Hume's philosophy is, in a certain sense, the high point of this tradition. In Hume, the concept of human nature is given what is quite possibly its maximal possible reach and application. For Hume, at least as I understand him, all questions are part of the science of nature, and in the end, nothing can really ultimately be understood, or at least understood properly without it. And to understand what Hume means by saying these things, by making these sort of sweeping assertions about everything being a part of human nature, we're going to have to answer some questions which are, as far as I know, I'd be happy to be corrected if I've missed something, are still largely unresolved in the academic literature. Particularly, we're going to have to understand what Hume means in calling his philosophy a complete system of the sciences built on a foundation almost entirely new. What we were just talking about, why does he think that he's introducing the experimental method is a similar kind of puzzle. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take a look at what Hume really means. Is it really possible in any way to say that Hume is right in saying that the treatise, or even the projected treatise, is a complete system of the sciences? Then I'm going to take a look at what Hume calls the elements of his philosophy and the method of explanatory reduction to these elements, before circling back in the end to where I'm beginning, which is to try to bolster the claims of those scholars recently who've been arguing that Hume's philosophy has to be seen, in addition to being Newtonian, as also being purposely written as a challenge to Newtonian science. If I have time, then I'll conclude with just very brief remarks about possible current relevance. Okay, so is Hume's treatise really a complete system of the sciences? Let's just very quickly look at the very familiar material from the introduction. Hume writes, "'Tis evident that all the sciences have a relation, whether greater or less, to human nature. Even mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion are in some measure dependent on the science of man. Why? Because they lie under the cognizance of men and are judged by their powers of faculties." Okay, so if we knew the extent and force of human understanding and could explain the nature of ideas we employ and the operations we perform in our reasonings, then he says we'd be able to maybe introduce changes and improvements. That makes it sound like the agenda here is kind of Kantian, and in fact several scholars have interpreted that recently, Hume in that way recently. I think he's actually not just trying to establish the limits of the sciences, although that's certainly true. All you need to do is turn the page, and then you see that he's going after something bigger. There's no question of importance whose decision is not comprised in the science of man, and there is none which can be decided with any certainty before we become acquainted with that science. In pretending, therefore, to explain the principles of human nature, we in fact propose a complete system of the sciences built on a foundation almost entirely new, which also raises the question with respect to the predecessors that Aaron is talking about, and the only one upon which it can stand with any security. Down the page, he calls the science of man the only solid foundation for the other sciences. In the abstract of 1740, he says, "Were his philosophy received, we must alter from the foundation the greatest part of the sciences." He calls the science of man the capital or the center of the sciences, and so on. So what exactly does Hume mean by all of this rhetoric, if it's not just a sort of a Kantian move of trying to limit the sciences, but really he thinks that he's founding a complete system of the sciences? What is he talking about? There actually have been surprisingly few attempts to try to read the treatise as though Hume actually means every single bit of what he's saying here. One of those is John Passmore, who I think very usefully points out that Hume sounds an awful lot like Descartes in these passages. The rhetoric of founding the sciences and the complete system of the sciences from scratch, and also Descartes' references to the weakness and solidity of the foundations, all of that sounds Cartesian. And of course, as many people have pointed out, Hume was actually sitting at La Flèche in Descartes' old stomping grounds, or when he was writing at least a significant part of the treatise. So it could have been on his mind. So let's just take briefly a look at Descartes. What would make Descartes' philosophy a system of the sciences? All right, so to begin with, we have the passage that Roger quoted from the Principles of Philosophy. The whole of philosophy is like a tree. The roots are metaphysics. The trunk is physics. And the branches emerging from the trunk are all the other sciences. Okay, so we have this neat tree image that makes everything hold together in something that's a system. And in fact, Descartes is very explicit about how this works, about why it's a tree, which not everybody is always explicit about. What he says is that knowledge, in order for it to be perfect, which is, of course, the knowledge that Descartes has, must be deduced from first causes or principles. So there's two parts. First of all, there's the first causes or principles, which must be so clear and evident that the human mind cannot doubt their truth. That's what makes them solid. That's what makes them foundations of all the rest of the sciences. And then there's the deductive method, although both Roger and David David Owen have emphasized that this isn't the medieval deductive method. Maybe that's worth discussing a little bit. But in any case, Descartes has what he calls a deduction, which is to say that he's deriving all of the rest of knowledge. Knowledge of other things must depend on these fundamental principles. Okay, so first we have indubitable principles, and then we believe in the deductive method that it can generate whatever knowledge that we need. Okay, so that's relatively clear what Descartes means by system of the sciences, but what could Hume possibly mean by this? So John Passmore goes on and he makes the following argument. He says that Hume's system of the sciences is actually analogous to that of Descartes. There's one major change that Passmore says Hume introduces, which is that in Hume's hierarchy, human psychology is the base. It replaces metaphysics, and in fact, it's what he says what Hume is referring to in the first inquiry when he refers to the true metaphysics. With regards to the rest of the structure, and I don't know, maybe that this is material that many people here know really well. I first saw a really nice laying out of the structure of Hume's tree in a doctoral dissertation by Miriam Boehm, which just came out. And if you take her sleuthing through the different parts of the treatise and the other works to try to understand what Hume's tree looks like, and you add that to Passmore's insight, you get this thing. Where Passmore contributed the bottom and Miriam Boehm the top, and I contributed like the green stuff. And what you see is human psychology is at the base. It provides the true metaphysics. Then there's the split, the two foundational books, Book 1 and Book 2, which Hume says more or less is the core and the base of everything else. That split follows Hume's distinction between impressions of sensation and impressions of reflection, so that, as Boehm has it, and it makes sense to me, the impressions of sensation then become the foundation for Hume's logic or his treatment of the way the understanding works, which then is the basis for the, let's call them the three Newtonian subjects, the things that appear in the Principia: mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion. Whereas you have to add sensations of reflection, which is essentially the basis of the passions, in order to then be able to talk intelligently about how human nature generates politics, criticism, and morals. Okay, so that's great. It's a good tree. The problem with it, I mean, it doesn't have a problem as a tree, but the problem in terms of the subject we're looking at is that it seems to leave the main question, or at least one of the main questions unanswered, which is, how could this possibly work? Because Hume is no Cartesian. He has neither indubitable first principles that are absolutely clear a priori, nor does he have the belief in the utility of deducing physics, for example, from indubitable first principles. So if he doesn't have either of those parts, then what makes Hume's system a tree? What holds it together? How do these sciences work together? Now, to try to give an answer to this question, I want to introduce another question from the literature from the last 10 years, kind of an interpretive riddle. Various people, including Peter Lobson and Don Garrett and Wayne Waxman, have, in the last decade, drawn attention to Hume's penchant for reductive explanation, for reducing all sorts of things to psychology. Lobson goes so far as to say that explanatory reduction is central and pervasive throughout the treatise and indeed throughout Hume's philosophy. But as far as I know, none of them can explain what it is, what's all this reduction doing there? What's the motive? Why does he have this penchant? Now, I think in order to answer this last riddle and the bigger one that we're looking at, the place that we need to start is with Boyle, with Robert Boyle's description of empirical science. I think that in various places in Boyle, and especially in his essay about the grounds and excellency of the mechanical hypothesis, there's actually quite a few texts, not just this paragraph, which I think make it very clear that even if Boyle doesn't use exactly the term system, that Boyle is in fact explaining how it's possible to have an empirical system of the sciences. Basically, in short, Boyle's understanding is using the word reduction. Sometimes he says resolution, reduce, resolve, and a couple of other synonyms. Basically, what he says is that all of the sciences can be reduced ultimately to physics through a series of reductions. For Boyle, those reductions, which probably even to this day, the most stunning example of using these kinds of explanatory reductions in order to reach a handful of fundamental concepts regulated by a few fundamental laws. Right? In the Principia, the thing, I think, I'm sure this will be controversial. There are lots of things impressive about the Principia, but at least I want to suggest that the central thing that knocks most of us out of the box about it is the ability to use this tiny, this very, very small vocabulary of fundamental terms and laws in order to, on the one hand, to explain projectile motion, in general terrestrial mechanics, the periodicity of the pendulum, for example, and at the same time also to be able to explain the orbiting of the planets around the sun and the orbiting of the satellites around the planets and the trajectories of the comets, which will look absolutely nothing like that. And most stunning, of course, the rising and falling of the tides under the influence of the moon's gravitation, which is just sort of, takes the cake, I think. Now, of course, Newton's method is not exactly Boyle's method. Newton is not reducing to, he's not doing a physical decomposition. The innovation in Newton is that he's reducing to terms that are entirely abstract. George E. Smith calls his method abductive, taking the term, I guess, from Peirce. And Newton himself is very unclear about this. I think the only place that there's a really, really clear description of the way Newton understands his own method that makes what Smith is talking about clear is in Query 31 in the Optics, written much after the Principia, obviously, where he says, we proceed from effects to their causes, from particular causes to more general ones, till the argument end in the most general causes. Right? This he calls the method of analysis. And then he turns around and says that there's this other leg of it called the method of synthesis, which consists in assuming the causes that have been discovered, right? Assuming that they're the basic principles, established as principles, and by them explaining the phenomena proceeding from them. Okay. Elsewhere, Newton actually refers to all the phenomena. I'll get to that passage maybe if we have time later. But if you put this in a schematic, it looks like this. Right? This is, I think, what Newton is describing for his own method. This is the left leg, which is the abductive inference. I put it in purple because there's traces of it in the Principia, but it's not what the Principia mostly does, this tracing up from effects to causes to more general causes. Most of what actually happens in the Principia is the second leg, the synthetic part, where Newton assumes the most general causes as the solid foundation to the thing, and then he reduces as many other phenomena as he possibly can to that. Okay, so this is at least one view of what the analytic synthetic means and what Newton would mean by experimental program. So what about Hume? As we heard just in the last hour, there's a serious question about what exactly Hume means when he's referring to his own method. Very often people focus on the part that's experience of an observation, and I think that that's not sufficient. The problem with experience and observation is that you can do all the experiencing and observing that you want, but experiencing and observing obviously doesn't explain anything. Right? Explanation has to come from the construction of a scheme of, a scheme of first principles or first causes or fundamental causes with which the phenomena can be understood. And Hume says this explicitly, repeatedly. In the introduction to the treatise, he says we must endeavor to render all our principles as universal as possible by tracing up our experiments to the utmost and explaining all effects from the simplest and fewest causes. In the inquiry, roughly the same thing. The utmost effort of human reason is to reduce the principles productive of natural phenomena to a greater simplicity, and to resolve the many particular effects into a few general causes, and so on. And there are more quotes like that. So Hume actually, I think, takes his method from the Principia. We have the same pattern where there's abductive inference, which is used to sort of bring together all sorts of different observations into a tight collection of simplest and fewest causes, which appear at the beginning of the treatise, and then almost the entire treatise, although again there are traces of this abductive activity, but almost the entire treatise is this other leg in orange, the reducing all effects to simplest and fewest causes. Okay, so that I think gives us at least a way in to look at the question of why reduction is central and pervasive in the treatise, because explanatory reduction on this view is basically what the treatise is all about. It's what Hume is trying to do, just as what Newton is trying to do. But it has the advantage, if you look at it this way, of being able to explain what he means by a system of the sciences, how the sciences are in a hierarchy, what exactly the foundation, or what roughly the foundation almost new is. And the big question left open then will be, so in Hume's system of the sciences, what are the simplest and fewest causes that he's thinking about? Okay, so it's little remarked, sometimes remarked, that Hume begins the treatise with a scheme of elements. Right, the first 13 pages, there's all sorts of reasons why it's a little bit foggy, but he explicitly says in Book 1, Part 1, that what he's doing is he's presenting what may be considered as the elements of this philosophy. I think that basically takes the first 13 pages, which is sections 1 through 4 of the treatise. And by my reading, basically what he comes out with is 2 fundamental mental entities and 4 basic fundamental operations. Obviously, you can argue about exactly what you're counting, but I think an important point here about these 6 fundamental elements has to do with what Jesse said yesterday. I think that there seems to be sort of a widely held belief that Hume is fundamentally dealing with one mental operation, associationism. Right? Many of his critics read him that way, and sometimes even his friends read him that way. But I think you can't really read Hume that way. If you go through and start counting what he counts as operations, I think that you get something that's a much richer picture. All right, so with regard to the basic psychological entities, obviously impressions and ideas, all the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves, this is again a piece of abduction here, resolve themselves into 2 distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas, and what distinguishes them is their force and liveliness. With regard to the operations, I count 4. There's the copying, well-known copying operation. An impression first strikes on the senses. Of this impression, there's a copy taken, and that we call an idea. Then there's another operation or pair of operations, which Hume uses and refers to all the time, but usually aren't discussed, which are the purposive uniting and separation of ideas. Right, that's a very traditional, I think scholastic, maybe Aristotelian way of thinking about things. But basically, when Hume thinks about language or thought as purposive, he thinks of it in terms of these operations, of the uniting and separation of ideas. And then third, there's the famous one, or the most famous one, the law of association, which is, or quasi-law, which automatically or semi-automatically establishes relations among ideas. And with respect to this, Hume says that the qualities from which the association more or less automatically will arise are three. Resemblance between two ideas will do it, contiguity in time or in place will do it, and relations of cause and effect. Finally, there's a fourth operation which unfortunately Hume only touches on this issue of force and vivacity in the very first sentence of the treatise, but he doesn't actually elaborate it until significantly later, which is too bad for making it a clean structure. But I think it is, in order to do the reductions he finds out that he basically has to have this additional fourth operation, which is the transferring of some kind of force, vivacity, wallop, power, solidity from impressions to ideas and onward. Okay, so these six elements, I claim, are the basis for a series of explanatory reductions, which do all sorts of interesting things, but fundamentally they're aimed at showing that the central categories in philosophy, including central categories in physics and mathematics, are, quote, nothing but these elements properly understood. We're nothing but, we're fortunate that Hume, apparently purposely, but maybe not on purpose, uses this flag of nothing but to tell us, now I'm doing reductions. So, for example, in Book 1, there's a lot of these, and I'm just going to go through them very quickly. If you want to discuss them, we can come back to them later. But in Book 1, he says the idea of a substance is nothing but a collection of simple ideas that are united by the imagination and of a particular name assigned to them. So people, probably almost everybody here, that's familiar to them. Likewise, he reduces abstract ideas to his scheme of elements. All general ideas are nothing but particular ones annexed to a certain term, which makes them recall upon occasion other individuals, meaning other specific ideas, which Hume says are latent. They're basically, they sort of surround the current idea like kind of a halo. And when we talk about an abstract idea, it's that construction, that psychological construction that we're talking about. Similarly, when Hume is talking about space and time, he also does these nothing buts. I'll just remind you about space in a sentence. Hume says Hume reduces space to extension, and extension he reduces to an abstract idea, and an abstract idea he reduces the way that we just discussed before. And he says that the idea of extension is nothing but a copy of colored points laid out in an array and of their manner and appearance. Afterwards, we have the experience of other colors. We omit the peculiarities of colors as far as possible, and we found an abstract idea merely on that disposition of points in which they agree. But at least if Hume's terms here are a little bit foggy, but I think that the maneuver that he's doing is very clear. What he's saying is everything that we know, everything that we can know about space is really things that we know about extension, and everything we can know about extension is nothing other than these arrays of colored points and their disposition. We can buy it, we cannot buy it, but at least what he's trying to do is clear. Just one last one. The most famous one probably is the reduction of causation to necessity, and then reduction of necessity, or at least I guess we could argue that it's a partial reduction, but let me for now say a reduction of necessity to the determination to carry our thoughts from one object to another. This, therefore, is the essence of necessity. Upon the whole, necessity is something that exists in the mind, not in objects. Necessity is nothing but that determination of thought to pass from causes to effects according to their experienced union. Okay, just for lack of time, I will skip these other great reductions that also do nothing buts. And I didn't even begin doing the reductions in books 2 and 3, and those exist too. Okay, so here basically what I've done is at the very bottom I've just stuck the elements of this philosophy, as Hume calls them, at the beginning of the treatise as the basis, what he considers to be the solid basis of the tree of the sciences. Okay, now I want to turn to this system not just as an imitation of Newton, but as something that is intended to displace Newton. All right, so well, as I think was clear, the position that I've been outlining up until now is actually to emphasize that Hume's debt to Newton is probably even greater than most people usually think it is. But in recent years, there's been the development of another view that I think is important in the scholarship, which begins with a little bit with the work of Peter Jones and then goes on sort of to full-blown with Michael Barfoot and Eric Schlieser, and you can see it in Mirren Boehm's dissertation that I mentioned, which argues that in fact Newton is one of the principal targets of the treatise. There's all sorts of arguments that have been made on the subject. I won't go into them. They're very interesting. My own view is somewhat different in emphasis. In particular, I don't buy the sort of the Barfoot-Schlieser thesis that what's going on is that there's sort of a Boyle versus Newton thing where Hume is siding with Boyle against Newton. Nevertheless, I do think that they're right in a lot of the things they point to, and especially they're right that the treatise has to be seen as an attack on Newton. So let me just sort of sketch how that works. Newton has, as everybody I think knows, a marked and, in Hume's view, admirable inclination towards, what we could call a moderate skepticism. Julia, if she's here, will correct me. If she's not here, then I can just say it. Okay, she's not here. Good. A moderate skepticism with respect to natural science, and that's sort of the way we think about Newton as the founder of modern scientific method. But he also has this tendency to be pretty reckless in his pronouncements about all sorts of things that science can do. Most famously with respect to God, he writes in the Principia that to treat of God from the phenomena is certainly a part of natural philosophy. So God is now part of natural philosophy. And he, for 3 or 4 pages, produces all sorts of arguments on the basis of he thinks that he can get from the Principia. But you don't, and I won't go into this because it's so familiar, but you also don't have to go into religion in order to find Newton being, sort of doing this kind of reckless maneuvering. I think that central tenets in his natural philosophy and the way he looks at mathematics are not that much more restrained. And certainly I think that's the way Hume sees it. And he has a response. I'll look first at the strategy and then at specific points. Strategy is as follows. Newton says in the introduction of the Principia that he hopes to see the method of the Principia extended not just in the Principia, but beyond it, to the point where all phenomena are going to be able to be reduced to physics, and in particular to forces of attraction and repulsion. For Newton, it's physics all the way down. Okay? Hume's program is really in response to this. Hume thinks that physics, along with everything else, meaning all effects, he calls them, right? All effects, including things that we think of as physics, can be reduced and should be reduced, if we want to understand things properly, to human psychology. Right, so what he's doing is he's taking Newton's program, and he's saying, well, hold on a second. You haven't gotten to the basic level. You can't know the truth about what it is that you're talking about. Okay? And as I pointed out before, the triad of mathematics, natural philosophy, natural religion that lie under the cognizance of men, that's exactly the subject matter of the Principia. That's what Hume is talking about when he says lying under the cognizance of men and being judged of by their powers and faculties. Okay, so in other words, what I'm saying is that Hume here subordinates the results of Newtonian science to the study of the mind. Right? That's the basic punchline. There's a new capital or center of the sciences. It's not physics, it's psychology. Now I want to look at a few specifics. His attack on the exactness of geometry, his attack on absolute time and space, the argument of potentially non-universal character of causal laws, which applied to Newton is devastating, and far out, the mind dependence of forces. Okay, first the exactness of geometry. The very first sentences of Newton's Principia begin with a discussion of what he calls rational mechanics. Right? That's the subject that Newton sees himself, that's the name he chooses for what it is that he's going to be doing. Right? And he writes, the whole subject of mechanics is distinguished from geometry by the attribution of exactness to geometry and of anything less than exactness to mechanics. Rational mechanics is to be a science expressed in exact propositions and demonstrations, unlike mechanics. The exactness of geometry permits the geometer, in this case Newton, to become what he calls a most perfect mechanic. Okay, there's all of this business about exactness and perfection, which I claim is exactly the kind of thing that you find pushing Hume's buttons everywhere he comes across it. Specifically, when you get to Book 2 of the treatise, he has the following to say, I think at least in part in reference to this. The geometric proofs are not properly demonstrations because they're built on ideas which are not exact, and on maxims which are not precisely true. When geometry decides anything concerning proportions of quantity, we ought not to look for the utmost precision and exactness. In other words, exactly what it is that Newton says we get out of it, we should not be looking for it. None of its proofs extend so far. It takes the dimensions and proportions of figures justly, but roughly, and with some liberty, nor would it err at all did it not aspire to such an absolute perfection. In other words, by reducing geometry to psychological operations, which is something I did not take you through here, what Hume says, you look at the psychological operations with which it's conducted, and you can clearly see that geometry is unable to be an exact science. Therefore, Newtonian mechanics, even just as a pure geometric construction, cannot be an exact science. Absolute space and time, various people have commented on this, so I won't go too into detail in this. But basically, in the first scholium, the scholium on Newton's definitions at the beginning of the Principia, he makes this very, very famous distinction between absolute space and time and relative space and time. And he specifically talks about the derivation of relative space and time from our senses. Okay, then he goes on to say, it is certainly very difficult to find out the true, right, here he explicitly says the true means absolute. So the absolute, it's certainly very difficult to find out the true motions of individual bodies. Why? Because the parts of that immovable space in which the bodies truly move make no impression on the senses. Nevertheless, he says, the search for an absolutely stable framework of reference in the universe is not entirely hopeless. It is possible that some body in the regions of the fixed stars or beyond is absolutely at rest. Where does he get this from? I don't know. Maybe Moti can help us with this, but I sure know that Hume doesn't like this kind of thing. All right? And when we take a look at Hume's reduction of space to ideas, right, to sensations, in fact, right, which then become ideas, what he's doing is exactly taking the relative leg of Newton's absolute space and time and defending that against the absolute leg, which he says simply, just do the reductions. There's no possible way, if Hume is right about space and time, there's no possible way that there can be any room for the introduction of an absolute time and space, because the sensations would be the same sensations from which he derives his relative time and space. Okay. Now for something that gets a little bit more adventuresome, as though that weren't enough. A number of scholars have pointed out that Hume's, in the treatise, in Book 3, Hume's rules by which to judge of causes and effects are almost parallel to Newton's 4 rules for the study of natural philosophy, or at least to the first 3. Right? There's been a lot of work done on comparing them, and a number of scholars have pointed out that Rule 7 of Hume's rules is one that doesn't seem to have any parallel in Newton. As far as I know, there hasn't been much speculation, at least I haven't seen, about why Hume has Rule 7. Right? Now, Newton himself, in his Rule 3, which is, for various reasons, parallel to Rule 7, but we'll skip that for right now, says the following: qualities that belong to all bodies on which experiments can be made should be taken as qualities of all bodies universally. All right? In other words, you do some experiments, you figure out what they add up to, and then you can take the rules that come up with it down to the finest elements of the finest particles of matter and out to the ends of the universe. Again, this is the kind of thing that Hume doesn't like very much, as we all know. And in Rule 7, he makes it very clear how much he doesn't like it. He says, we must beware, when any object increases or diminishes with the increase or diminution of a cause, 'tis to be regarded as a compound effect. The absence or presence of one part of the cause is here supposed always to be attended with the absence or presence of a proportional part. All right, that he thinks is fine, but then he has this caveat. We must beware not to draw such conclusions from a few experiments. A certain degree of heat gives pleasure. If you diminish that heat, the pleasure diminishes. But it does not follow that if you augment it beyond a certain degree, the pleasure will likewise augment, for we find that it degenerates into pain. Okay, in other words, variable qualities may vary proportionally within a certain range of experience. But Hume says you can't talk about the universe. You can't talk about absolutely everything in the universe as being based on the range of experience that you've experienced. And that's a severe limitation because, for example, Newton in this passage specifically says that he draws universal gravitation from exactly this kind of inference. So it's very possible that Hume is saying here more or less explicitly that the physics of the Principia may only be locally valid. In fact, I think it's hard to read him as saying anything else. Finally, and too quickly because I just for shortage of time, there's something even wilder that I just want to touch on, which is that we know that Newton, although he doesn't claim to have proved this in any sense at all, that Newton writes in the preface to the Principia and returns to this later on in his writings, that he suspects that all phenomena may depend on certain forces by which particles of bodies either are impelled toward one another or are repelled from one another. Now, he sees, when we say physics all the way down with reference to Newton, he's talking about the fundamental thing that he attributes to bodies is forces of attraction and repulsion. Now, I haven't seen it emphasized, and I think it bears more discussion, that Hume specifically, when he's talking about necessity, he specifically, in a number of places, refers to necessity also as being forces. In fact, he specifically says the terms efficacy, agency, power, force, energy, necessity, connection, and so on are all nearly synonymous. Okay, and his point with respect to necessity is also made with respect to forces. When we talk of any being as endowed with a power of force proportion to any effect, in other words, again, gravitation and other Newtonian forces would fit that. When we speak of a necessary connection between objects and suppose that this connection depends upon an efficacy or energy, we have really no distinct meaning and make only use of common words without any clear and determinate idea of what it is that we're talking about. But this later turns into 20th century empiricism likes this term. But here's the funny thing. Right? We read this passage before that necessity is nothing but an internal impression of the mind or a determination to carry our thoughts from one object to the other. This is the basis of Hume's famous comment in the abstract of a book lately published to the effect that necessity, in fact, this feeling of necessary connection is the cement of the universe. It's what holds together, as far as we are concerned, it holds together all the objects in the universe. What I haven't seen referred to, and I think is worth discussing, is that it seems to me that by precisely the same token, all of the forces, all Newtonian forces, are exactly the cement of for Newton, these forces of attraction and repulsion, they're what create actual bodies. The ability to create actual bodies with mind-independent objective forces, it seems to me that that's exactly what it is that he's worried about here, to put it, I'd say, and it's, to put it gently. Okay, so I think that that's at least a pretty good start at being able to see a line of attack that allows us to think about Hume's treatise and Hume's project more generally as being something that leaves a tremendous amount of space for admiring Newton and for adulating Newton, and at the same time seeks to displace Newton with a different way of looking at things. All right. So just to summarize, a couple of words about possible relevance. I suggested that Hume's philosophy was indeed a system of the sciences, and that it was indeed built on a foundation almost entirely new, because the particular abductions that he does, that he introduces, those are new foundations that appear almost nowhere else. And that one of his central claims, obviously, is to challenge Newtonian science and to displace it. Now, in the shootout between Hume on the one hand and Newton and the Newtonians on the other, I guess it's pretty obvious that Hume lost in a big way. We don't find too many physicists and philosophers today who would sort of sign on to Hume, at least at first glance. Most people see themselves roughly as being some kind of Newtonians, in the sense that they see, not that they reject Einstein, of course, or Heisenberg, but in the sense that they see their metaphysics consists of physics all the way down. And I'm not sure that this is a comfortable place to land, at least with regard to Hume scholarship. On the specifics of Hume's argument with Newton, and here there's various people who know the physics better than I do and the mathematics, but my impression is that if you take into account at least what's today considered known or thought about mathematics and physics, Hume actually didn't do so badly at all. On absolute space and time, on the ability of geometry to get the real exactly right, on the local validity of Newton's laws of motion and their application to gravitation, I think it's possible to argue that, that on all these points, Hume actually, surprisingly, saw farther than Newton did in the Principia. And with respect to this fourth wild point, the mind dependence of necessary connection, well, let's say that neither contemporary philosophy nor contemporary natural science, as far as I know, have been able to digest this. I'd be happy to be pointed to things if I don't know them. Maybe the jury's still out on that. Hume's insights in these cases are not usually credited to his science of human nature. And in general, his system of the sciences, built on a foundation almost entirely new, to the extent that we talk about it all, we see it, I think, as kind of a historical dead end. So two last comments. First of all, with respect to cognitive science, I think it's a problem. I at least find it problematic that cognitive science doesn't see itself in the business, as far as at least the parts I'm familiar with, of explaining physics. The last major attempts to try to go down this Humean road, probably Ernst Mach, William James, and especially Bergson, whose reductions of physics and calculus to operations of the mind, I think, are breathtaking and stunning, and I don't know of anybody who's disproved them, but they're completely forgotten just about. And with respect to philosophy, the current ubiquitous debates between naturalists and quietists, I think it's a little bit troubling, let's say, that Hume is routinely taken by both sides to be the paradigmatic spokesman of the Newtonian position, which is in fact exactly the position that he set out to undermine and to oppose. And if we want to advance beyond the present standoff in philosophy, it might be worth taking a more careful look at David Hume.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, this following paper, one after the other, and in a sense, completely in contrast as I read them. In the sense, it seems to me that while Aaron was stressing especially the fact that this, this new system is based exactly and comes out from his intellectual depths, let's put like this, and by discussing them where Newton is marginal, you either by when you stress the fact that Hume imitates, or on the contrary, when he criticizes, the Principia are at the very center of your paper. So I find this very interesting. And on the other side, I ask if it is possible to find a kind of conciliation. Is it possible? How do you deal with what Aaron was saying? How do you match each other, if it is possible?
Well,
to do?
I don't.
This is what I.
Yeah, no. I definitely appreciate the the contrast, and I appreciated as Aaron was talking. But at least from my perspective, there doesn't have to. I don't see why there has to be a contradiction. I'd be happy to have an argument with Aaron about something, and maybe we'll have one. But on no. But I just to begin with, I have to plead ignorance about most of the characters that Aaron is talking about. And so they're just not so familiar to me, most of them. And in the second place, the conciliation is something. I mean, it's clearly happening. It's clearly happening in Hume. I mean, when the subtitle, like I don't have any intention of denying, he has this subtitle. The subtitle says that he's introducing the methods of natural philosophy, the experimental method into the moral sciences, and then he has this genealogy where he explicitly says, I'm following in the wake of these people, and there's no doubt that if you add that to this point that has been stressed by various scholars who've been doing this Newton-Hume contrast in recent years, which is that the bottom line is that Hume may be pretty good at metaphysics, but he really cares an awful lot more about the moral sciences. And he says that so explicitly in so many places that there's no point in arguing with it. I would say that part of the reconciliation is that he sees the system that's emerging from the thought of Boyle, the thought of Newton, and especially the thought of the Newtonians, who go much farther than Newton's groupies. Just take a lot of these things and just go to the wall on them. And Hume is already feeling the blast of that. And so I think that a part of this whole strategy is, certainly I think he believes all the things that he's saying, but the reason that he wants psychology as the foundation of the sciences is because he wants people to stop trying to turn human beings into what they're going to become if they end up being, and this is just obviously speculation, is completely debatable. I have no text to prove this, but my overall feeling is that he loves what Newton achieved and he can't stand where he thinks it's going, and so he wants to put it in its place.
Is this what, yeah, I guess it is. There's a very, very interesting paper and extremely ambitious, and there are a lot of details that I think we can discuss. But I think the general picture of, if I can sort of summarize the point of view that you're supporting, which is also what other people like Eric Schlieser are trying to do, is paint Hume as using the prestige of Newtonian science to attack Newtonian science. So there is, obviously the definitely the appeal to the prestige of the experimental method as exemplified in the Principia, but to attack in a certain way the details of the Principia. One thing, though, I was a little puzzled at your attribution to Newton of the idea that everything is to be explained in terms of physics. What it is that you were quoting from the introduction to the Principia is certainly the intimation of a larger program. But what he is talking about, as I understand it, there is using the methods of the Principia, the methods as Newton used them in the Principia to explore the forces holding the planets in their orbits and the forces that are causing the heaviness of bodies, to explore other forces in nature. But I don't think I see anywhere there an intimation that absolutely everything in the world can be understood in those terms. And I don't think he has the ambition. Modi may correct me here, but I don't think he has the ambition to explain absolutely everything in purely physical terms. On the other hand, I think Hobbes definitely does. It may be, Hume is certainly attacking Newton in those respects, but I think Hobbes may be another target, and 18th century materialists as well, another target of Hume's polemic.
Okay. Thanks. Just one one thing about Barfoot and Schlieser is that I really think that Hume's admiration for Newton is completely sincere. So a lot of those texts where scholars are reading a particular turn of phrase as being like a kick under the table, that kind of thing. A lot of those are things that don't speak so well to me. They don't fit so well to me. So that I really do want to find something that's more of a balanced view. I think Hume really admires Newton, and his imitation is not just in order to use Newton's prestige in order to harm Newton. With respect to the issue of the phenomena, it's possible that I may be guilty of precisely that kind of overreading. What he says in the preface to the Principia, at least in the new translation that I'm looking at, is that all phenomena, that he wants to explain all phenomena. Now, it may be that that's
all physical phenomena.
Right. It may be that is a certain kind of phenomenon, and that sort of brings you to the question of what does he mean by phenomena. I think in Hume, at least, it's much clearer that when Hume says all effects, he really means all effects. Right? There simply are no effects that are caused by anything whatsoever that he doesn't think that he's going to ultimately be able to explain in the way that he's doing. So it may be that I'm reading a little bit too much of Hume into Newton. My guess is, though, that when Hume is thinking about Newton, he's also thinking about Newtonians. And here, this is something that I, again, really don't know very much about. But if you just take a look at, for example, the Halley's ode to Newton that Newton agreed to have appended to the, well, Halley paid for it, I understand. So, but still, that ode is it's very hard to find anything that is not going to be reduced to sort of Newtonian terms in the spirit of what's going on there. So it may be that by the time we get to Hume, his attack on Newton is motivated by other people who've taken it further.
There's a forest of hands here, and I don't know who was first. I mean...
I've got the mic, but I can pass it to someone else.
No, I did point to you, yeah.
Okay. I also thought that was really fascinating and quite persuasive. One suggestion about possible exaggeration or overreading. If you look back at the passage from the introduction to the treatise that you cited, the passage where he says even mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion are in some measure dependent on the science of man. First of all, I'd stress the even, and secondly, in some measure dependent on the science of man. And he doesn't say there, at least, that he has any plan to reduce mathematics, natural philosophy, or natural religion to the science of man. He does say, and you pick up on this rightly, I think, that, or he implies that there'll be changes and improvements in the sciences, in those sciences, if we're thoroughly acquainted with the extent and force of human understanding. And at the end of the paragraph, he indicates that the main improvements that he's looking for, and this is probably directed at Newton among others, is in natural religion, the third of the three, where he almost certainly disagrees with much that Newton has to say and wants to reject Newton's extension of his views to natural religion. He doesn't indicate that mathematics and natural philosophy will undergo as radical a change. But even if it undergoes a change and improvement, that's not the same as a reduction. So I would think that maybe you're going a little too far in suggesting that he means to reduce all of these things to the science of man.
Well, you're definitely presenting sort of the accepted reading. I definitely want to do this over-reading. Maybe I'll retreat a little bit, but not at this point. The next thing that happens when you turn the page is that he speaks in much more categorical terms. Okay, and we touched on this. There is no question of importance whose decision is not comprised in the science of man, and there is none which can be decided with any certainty before we become acquainted with that science. Now, I think that the proof is not in the argument between these two paragraphs that are almost right next to each other. We're never going to resolve that. The proof is in what he goes ahead and does. right? In other words, if he does in fact go ahead and attempt and maybe even succeed in some or many of these kinds of reductions, then I think that the second reading is justified. And if he doesn't do those things, then the first reading, the more orthodox, more moderate reading is will be fine. So is he going to do more than introduce just changes and improvements into the sciences? Well, I think so. It depends on how radical you think it is for somebody to say geometry, which up until this point has been considered to be, by an awful lot of my predecessors, to be something that can be brought to basically absolute exactness, can be shown to be something that is approximate and fallible due to the fact that it is itself can be reduced. That is nothing but operations of the human understanding. Okay, now it's interesting. I mean, I understand that to argue historically, it's not exactly fair to start bringing in Gauss and Helmholtz and I don't know what else happens, but the fact is that the intuition that Hume is looking at here, the intuition that goes, look, all these right angles that you're talking about, they're all drawn from experience. We don't know if they're really right angles. We don't really know if there's 180 degrees in a triangle. It's roughly 180 degrees, that we know, but we don't know if it's really so. The argument that he's making is actually in the 19th century, as far as I understand it, what becomes sort of like the runway up to non-Euclidean space and post-Einsteinian physics. And in fact, I don't know Einstein at all, but I heard John Norton quoting this apparently famous passage in Einstein that Einstein says he was reading, his circle was reading Hume and Mach when he was working on these theories. So the connection may even be not completely, totally random. I don't have any way of judging that. But to go back to the question of, is this a repair or is this a reduction which basically supplants the old way of thinking? Well, I think that's kind of it's parallel to saying, is Einstein a repair of Newton or is it a completely new way of thinking that supplants it? And I think the answer is pretty clear. I think that Hume sees it as being a completely new foundation for all the sciences. And since he has some, pulls it off in a number of places, I think we should credit him that he knew what he was talking about when he wrote it and that he went on and did it.
What does it say? One more question.
That's me, I guess, since I have the microphone. That was so provocative and interesting, I can hardly get my own thoughts in order, but let me try to put it as briefly as I can. You mentioned Kant right at the start, and although there's way too much going on to want to drag Kant into this, it did occur to me that in place of your tree, we might think of Kant's famous image of his Copernican revolution, and we might, building on your project, we might think of Hume as similarly wanting to put human nature right at the center of the universe of all the sciences, where the sciences, as I think is clear, encompass, obviously not just physics and the natural sciences, but encompass theology, encompass mathematics, encompass ethics. And so, I mean, if we take it in this, as strongly as you want to, it's an extraordinary program, then we might consider, well, if human nature instead of what? What would be the alternative to put at the center of the universe? And I think you were thinking of, well, the natural world. And that's certainly a way to think about it. And if you think about it that way, then that highlights Hume as skeptic and or Hume as idealist. But another way to think about it is putting human nature at the center of the world rather than God. I don't think God even came up in your talk, but I mean, if you take the case of Newton, Newton is not a standard issue 20th century scientific realist. For Newton, God gets into the story all over the place in the conception of space, the conception of forces, the conception of laws of nature, and so if you think of Hume as not just wanting to supplant external reality in this way, and to reduce it to something else, but wanting to do that same sort of thing with God, I mean, you get a different sort of story, and maybe you get Hume not as a skeptic / idealist, but Hume as a humanist, right? And that would be the moral of your story about human nature, Hume's humanism.
Well, first of all, I think that that's just true. I think that Hume does see himself that way, and I think that if I knew more of the historical context that you're referring to, then I might simply, just accept it. I think in general, the kinds of things that push Hume's buttons are dogmatists, and in that day and age, that certainly includes almost everybody in his environment who's talking about God, right? So I don't see myself as being an expert in Hume on theology because I don't know enough about the theology he's responding to. But I think that the number one thing that drives him crazy is having people insisting that they can deduce God's existence from, or just about anything else. I mean, you actually find him, for example, in the Inquiry, talking about geometers and metaphysicians and comparing them explicitly to priests and saying, sometimes when you listen to these geometers and metaphysicians and hear them talking about indivisibility of space, they're actually worse than priests who've purposely tried to invent all this mumbo jumbo in order to blind people's reason. So I think he's definitely the kind of humanist that you're talking about in inclination. But I think the thing that he really can't stand is just about anybody who's going around and saying that they can, a priori this and deduce that and get to things that they can't get to. One of the many things I don't know about this subject is that in the 20th century there's a famous Orthodox Jewish theologian named Eliezer Berkovitz, who is very congenial to my way of thinking about things. I actually have his doctoral dissertation that he wrote on David Hume for Kohler, the founder of Gestalt, one of the founders of the Gestalt psychology. And after I get through that thing, then I'll probably be more intelligent on this subject as well.